welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything to do with mental health and psychology. In this video we'll be going through an overview of the whole KSA, and it will almost be like a whistle-stop tour. So if you've been procrastinating, if you've just never thought of doing CBT and you've thought of applying and you just require it for your interview and you just don't have that much time to do it in, this will just be a whole overview of what to write in there, what to do. It won't be as detailed as my other videos, which some of them are more than an hour long, so this will just be a few sentences, tips on each section. So KSA 1 is life stages and development. So in this, talk about all the life stages, your experiences of having worked with all the life stages or just having knowledge of all the life stages and what they mean, the development within those stages, and also talk about the key theories that you might know. So here, as evidence, you can use your transcript, developmental psychology, or any other types of psychology that have told you about life stages, like social psychology might have told you about the socialization within, or the lack of socialization in each stage, or changing roles, changing identities, things like that. So any modules that you remember, or go through your modules and kind of look at where they've spoken about different types of life stages and development. Then go into talking about applying this to practice. So talk about how you've adapted your practice based on someone's life stage or their developmental stage, for example, their cognitive development. So how, when you're talking to young people, you might have adapted it, and talking to someone who is of older generations, how you might have adapted the information for them. Or someone who's a young adult, the tools and the skills that you would share with them might be different to someone who is like 5. Does that make sense? And then relate it always back to the theory, back to the question, how this might be relevant for your role as a CBT therapist. So on to the next one, which is health and social care approaches. In this, and the BABCP guide says this, is to focus on legislation, national guidance, policies, procedures, service models, local policies, and just talk about how you would apply these legislation. So the evidence you can use for this is any trainings you've been on within the health care profession or roles that you've had, your undergraduate degree, mandatory trainings will normally have this, any CPDs that you've been on. So the third one, psychopathology and diagnostic skills. Here you can talk about classification systems, you can talk about the types of psychopathology, you can talk about diagnostic criteria, the classification scales, systems, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these. You can also talk about clinical complexity and how you would deal with this within practice. So maybe the models you've come across, the theories that you've come across, and how they've informed your practice. For example, looking at the underlying psychological processes that are going on versus diagnostics, how they might conflict, how actually diagnostics sometimes might be useful. Again, here the evidence could be from your undergraduate trainings you've been on, CPD, so mental health modules, clinical psychology modules, things like that. So the next one is models of therapy. And in models of therapy, what you can talk about is key theories and key models of therapy that you've seen in your practice. So you might want to explain how this model or theory explains the presenting problem and how it helps you to understand what difficulties the person's going through. So how it might explain depression, for example. And use examples from your practice of where you've seen this. So even if you haven't worked with it directly, see how other people have used those models and theories to help the formulation or the understanding of the presenting problem, if that makes sense. So that's talking about the application that you've seen, and then also talk about its implications. Are there any shortcomings of that theory, and how does that apply in practice? So usually in practice, teams of therapists work together. So is that something maybe you can comment on? You can also talk about how the approach has influenced you, how you've used it in your practice, and how you've helped someone using that model or theory, or maybe a combination of models and theories. And you can also talk about maybe how within practice they might work together. Does that make sense? And here you can use modules such as clinical psychology, mental health modules, anything that is clinically related in terms of talking about different types of therapies would work well here. You can also provide training certificates, CPDs, any training that you've been on at work that are related to educating you on different models or theories. So that brings us on to number 5. And number 5 is competency in key relationship skills. Here, highlight the key relationship skills, what they are, and define them. And then you can talk about the therapeutic relationship and how these key skills tie into the therapeutic relationship and why they're important. You can then talk about how you would begin, maintain and end therapeutic relationships, and then extend this beyond that and talk about how you would use these key skills to be able to create relationships with your co-workers, with your colleagues, with external agencies. And also within this, give examples. So examples of when you've applied these key relationship skills within your practice. That brings us nicely on to number 6, managing and maintaining records and reports. Here you can talk about policies and procedures, legislation, and how these tie into practice. So you might also want to touch on confidentiality. Here you might also want to comment on what makes good record keeping. And you might also want to talk about referrals and providing confidential information to external agencies and what policies and procedures might be around that, what responsibilities you might have when you're doing that. You might also want to talk about report writing, the language that you use, and how you describe a situation. For example, using language that is therapeutic and wouldn't cause harm to the person who the information is about. So this you might get through training, CPDs, and especially because it's in mandatory trainings for most jobs. Here you can also put your job spec or a person specification for a job that you've actually gone on and done as evidence for this KSA. So number 7 is communication with services and colleagues. Here that can mean professionals and non-professionals. And so you might want to talk about how you would adapt your language, adapt clinical jargon, or how actually clinical jargon might actually be useful in some situations. So you might also want to talk about how you would adapt your approach as well as your language to meet the needs of the individual or the group. This you can mostly get from your induction trainings at workplaces or general work training that might be additional. It might also be a CPD that you've done, and you can again use a job description or a job specification as evidence for this. And obviously for jobs that you've gone on and done, not just jobs you've applied for or got the job at interview and you never actually went on and done the job. Hopefully that makes sense. Number 8, awareness of risk. So this is risk in general, to self, to others, and from others. So it really requires you to, what they're assessing here is a broad view of risk. So the assessment of risk, the management of risk, how you would go about it, the safeguarding policies, procedures, legislation, again, you might want to add in here. I would also highlight key types of risks for each section. So talk about grooming, suicidality, exploitation, any risks that you've come across in your workplace, and describe them as in the key points of being able to identify what are the risk factors, what are the warning signs, how would you know this has happened to someone if they don't directly tell you, what follow-up things you need to do. Again, you can also link this into the therapeutic relationship, confidentiality, creating a safe space for that person, breaches in confidentiality, how you would manage that. Again, you can get this from work training, especially induction training in a lot of workplaces. You might also want to look at your job specs for the jobs that you've done or job descriptions for jobs that you've done. So next, number 9 is comprehension of research. And in this section, you might have this experience through undergraduate, dissertation, projects, research modules, and this is something that you can add in here. You might want to talk about research issues, research methods, how this may have actually enhanced your practice. Maybe you've done service evaluation, audits, QI projects, things like that, that you might want to add in here. Again, you can add evidence of your dissertation. You can talk about your dissertation in here, any postgraduate research that you might have done. Although postgraduate research is not really necessary, you might want to talk about literature reviews, critical reviews that you might have done, undergraduate, postgraduate for a service. Number 10 is commitment to ethical principles. So here, define what ethical principles are. What are they? What do they look like in practice? Define any laws or legislations that might back up ethical practice. NHS values you might want to talk about. So really define and explain ethical principles. Then you can go on to talking about clinical application. You can also talk about how there might have been a dilemma between two ethical principles that you've had and how you overcame that, because you have to give examples in this section. And that could be experience that you've gained from undergraduate modules, from training at work, safeguarding training. Yeah, so we're getting through them rather quickly. But again, this is a whistle-stop tour, so that's almost the whole point of this video. And I know I'm talking really, really fast, just to make sure that this is condensed and not as waffly as the rest of my videos. So apologies for talking really fast, but it's the only way we're going to get through all 14 in a relatively short amount of time, because I do ideally want this video to be less than 20 minutes, hopefully. So anyway, let's get through the next few and then the video's over and you can stop listening to me rambling. Anyway, let's get on to KSA number 11, fitness to practice and suitability at a personal level. Here what they want to know about is your personal and professional qualities that you might have that will benefit you in this role and make you suited to the role of the therapist and just a healthcare professional in general. So here you might want to talk about your personal qualities, your professional qualities. Here you also might want to talk about how reflective you are and how that might feed into your practice. You might also want to talk about how you're aware of your limitations, particularly within maybe roles that you've had in the past. Maybe you've been an assistant and you're aware of that an assistant isn't a therapist, for example. You might want to also talk about how you're aware of your boundaries with clients, and that although sometimes self-disclosure of certain types might actually be useful, other things might not be as useful disclosing. You might also want to talk about the self-care and self-management strategies that you've developed over the years, and that self-awareness of your biases and your triggers and the things that are more difficult for you to deal with. You might want to also reflect on that and how you've learnt to overcome that, for example, using supervision. This brings us on nicely to KSA 12, which is self-evaluation and being reflective. So here, being reflective of your biases, self-formulating, which is, formulation just means an understanding. So being able to understand who you are, what your life experiences are, and how they've shaped you. And then looking at the interaction between you and your practice. So what are your biases? What are your triggers? What are things that are difficult for you to handle? What are some of the things that you've developed over time of working in mental health that have made it easier to work with the emotive environment that mental health is? So as well as looking at the internal processes, also looking at maybe the external values or the internal values that you hold, the belief systems that you hold, and the things that you might project on to other people. So being aware of your own values and beliefs and the internal processes, but also being aware of the external stuff. So some people might have assumptions about you. How will you deal with that? If your religious belief is very obvious, how will you deal with that when someone has a prejudice against it? Or says a comment where you might find it offensive, or it might be something that you're personally attacked by? Especially if your, let's say your religious belief or a value you hold is not as obvious. Someone makes a comment, how will you deal with that? How will you manage that within the therapeutic process? Things like that. So some people might have, skin colour is a big one, that people might have prejudices against that, and how you would deal with that if that was to come up. You might also want to talk about how you have come up with different ways to aid your reflection, so supervision, debriefs, but also your internal individual techniques that you've come up with. So one is self-reflection, self-practice, which is one that I've mentioned in another video. But those kind of techniques that you come up with to be able to reflect on maybe your blind spots or parts of yourself that you're not as comfortable with, if that makes sense. So number 13, has an inquiring mind and the scientist practitioner. Here, highlight what the scientist practitioner approach is, how you have inquiring mind, the qualities and the things that you need to be able to be curious and inquiring. You can also talk about how you've used evidence-based practice, but also practice-based evidence, how you've contributed to the evidence base, how you've gone and addressed maybe limitations within your knowledge by doing extra reading, going on extra training, CPDs, all that kind of stuff. Maybe you've been involved in a research project, maybe within your workplace, or as an additional thing, part of your undergraduate, part of a postgraduate, service development, audits, things like that. Just any research experience that shows that you're meshing your clinical practice and your research together, or them individually. Does that make sense? So finally, we're on to the clinical experience record. And this is a lot like a CV. And if you look at the set form that's on the BABCP website, then you'll actually be able to tell how it's very similar to what a CV would look like. So you just put any mental health experience that you've had, first what I would do would be to go back to my CV and then get the specific dates, because some courses have a specific and strict criteria of you have to have exactly 2 years of experience within mental health. So within that form, it asks for the years and dates of that experience, the employer, the role. Then it asks you to give details. So what I would do is put what you did in that role, the duties, responsibilities, the client group you worked with, the age group you worked with, the type of models or theories that you might have directly used or worked within, the teams that you worked as part of, so the multidisciplinary team and as well as the multi-agency teams, what teams you linked in with, maybe that specialist area of mental health. For example, you worked in addiction, psychosis, eating disorders, I would highlight that. So as well as clinical presentations, I would also highlight maybe the complexities that I've worked with, the issues that I've worked with, so broader issues rather than just specifically mental health. I would also highlight what skills and tools or any key experiences that I've had in that area. I would also comment on, as well as the model's clinical experience, I would also comment on the diversity, so ethnocultural diversity, neurodiversity, the types of clients, the need to adapt different models, how I went about adapting that, adapting language, adapting different things of maybe I've done within the ethnocultural group, I might have adapted some forms of therapy to be more receptive to their needs. Yeah, so that's it for the video, guys. There will be one final video on the KSA, which is just my broad tips for the KSA in general, and then the KSA series is officially over. And so after this, I'll just go answer comments in the comments section. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, any queries you want to ask me, instead of making a video, I'll just answer it down in the comments. Just create a community, and obviously in years to come, if someone needs help with the KSA, coming back to this video, they will see those questions there, so it benefits everyone. And yeah, so my next video will be the final KSA video. I know it's heartbreaking, it's the end of an era, but we need to move on at some point, you know? So yeah, like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for 200 subscribers. Yeah, it's nearly been a year for this channel to be up, so thank you for everyone who has already subscribed, commented, liked my videos. It is much appreciated. Thank you, and I shall see you in the last KSA video, which is next.